Hello, everybody. For those of you that don't know, my name is Dean Haystack, and today I'd like to go through the introduction of my examination of the event of COVID 19, which I've titled Incidents, Accidents, and Malevolence, an Idiocy Theory. The agents of suffering is what we're going to cover, and all suffering is either incidental, accidental, or malevolent. I learned from the medical insurance industry when I used to work in it that the primary classification when calculating contributions towards medical insurance are injury and illness. And pregnancy is contentious in this regard, as pregnancy doesn't fit into either of those primary classifications. Is pregnancy an injury or is it an illness? Is the question. It's an important distinction when considering risk, as illnesses are largely incidental, yet injuries are more often accidental or even inflicted. The insurance industry, and more directly the medical aid or health insurance industry, is the only industry that I'm aware of where one person will get a service from another and somebody else pays the bill. If I'm a medical aid client, I pay a monthly subscription or a premium to the medical aid. In a medical emergency, the medical aid pays the doctor or the hospital. There are at times excess costs, but in general, the medical aid will pay most of the bills. The dynamic of this tripod structure opens the door for abuses by service providers, with the result that medical aid premiums are often inflated or loaded, as they say, to account for fraud. At the same time, patients or clients seldom, if ever, query treatment, prescriptions, costs, or the accounts delivered by the service provider because someone else is paying the bill. Imagine you are buying a car and somebody else is going to pay for it. The salesperson can sell you any accessories that he wants, even if you don't need it, and will never use it because you don't pay the bill. So what difference does it make to you? If we break that down, we see nearly all the authority of that interaction in the hands of the medical service and product providers, with little authority or demand on the clients to accept responsibility or accountability, and you may even say that it's discouraged. Have we handed over the well-being of our bodies to the medical service and product providers, is the question. The nuances of the structure are worth mentioning in giving thought to the complexities and potential for less than ideal outcomes. Instead of being active and eating healthily, reducing our risk of illness and disease, do we rather more heavily rely on doctors' visits and prescriptions? That's a question. Has it become a pathology in our society? And can we rely on the fraternity to take charge of our well-being? Are questions that we are going to cover. Trust isn't just about honesty. I might trust you to be honest, yet are you reliable? You might be reliable, are you responsible? If you are responsible, are you also free to act without prejudice or bias? I might trust your desire to do good, but do you have the capacity to pull it off? After all, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I heard a story once about a lady in her good intentions who decimated a village in Africa with her good intentions. HIV and AIDS was a problem in this specific village, and her compassion led her to source, arrange, and pay for a medical intervention for these people who were suffering. She bought an antiretroviral cocktail for the sick. She visited the area, and her experience with the people moved her. She was wealthy, and the cocktail was relatively inexpensive. The drugs arrived and were shared amongst the sick, and a standing order to continue supply was ordered so that when she left, the people could still continue to get their medication. The villagers, without guidance, support, and oversight, became irregular in taking their medication and formed resistance to that cocktail of drugs. The alternative cocktail of drugs was many times more expensive than the initial prescription, and the project was abandoned, leaving the sick to fend for themselves without extra support anymore because of a much more expensive solution. Trust is a way larger consideration than just honesty or intent. Returning to the original question, is pregnancy an injury or an illness? Well, laughably, when I was in the industry, and I don't know if this is true, but I was told that it is a self-inflicted injury. I don't know whether that's accurate, but unless there are complications, pregnancy isn't really even a medical emergency. Is it an injury or even an illness? One of the major causes of death for women before medical interventions was indeed in childbirth. So before we go down a rabbit hole of the evils or merits of medicine, big pharma, medical insurance, let's just keep in mind that where there is medical care, it's rare for women to suffer death in childbirth today. Although pregnancy seems or may not be an injury or an illness, it certainly seems for the most part that it is at least something which many or most women suffer, for better or for worse. Although pregnancy may not be an injury or an illness, it seems for the most part that it's at least something which most women suffer, and for better or for worse, would prefer the security and assistance of medical interventions, consultation, and care. The suffering which is pregnancy could invite great joy and meaning, yet for some, tragedy and even trauma. All suffering is either incidental, accidental, or malevolent, or a combination of these things. So incidents are environmental events. They occur out of regular processes and interactions. Accidents are caused through ignorance, neglect, and stupidity, largely due to our inadequacy as humans. And malevolence is a willing act of wrong towards another or even self. Pregnancy is incidental. In some cases, it's accidental and mostly self-inflicted, although with assistance, except when it isn't, in which case it's an outcome of malevolence. You would have a planned pregnancy, an unplanned pregnancy, or a forced pregnancy, one conceived without consent. In each scenario, whether incidental, accidental, or malevolent, the outcome of pregnancy being determined, which is the same, the response in managing the resulting pregnancy varies quite dramatically. The impact of pregnancy changes from one scenario to the other. The emotions, anxiety, decision-making, support, stigmas, social considerations, preparations, options, choices, legal implications, and suffering in every way in each scenario is entirely different. So was the pandemic incidental, accidental, or malevolent? And what about the coordinated response? Causation matters. To simplify the concept, you and I are playing catch. I missed the ball or miscatching the ball, and the ball hits me in the face. That would have been an accident, but it would have been incidental because we were playing a game of catch. I feel physical pain, yet no animosity or anger towards you. If, however, we weren't playing catch, and you throwing the ball hits me in the face, at the very least, I would be shocked and probably very, very angry. What's the difference? The injury is the same in both cases. Why would my reaction change? It's because the environment has changed. When I was expecting the ball and it hit me in the face, I wasn't in danger. But if it is unexpected, then I realize that I'm in danger. You are hurting me. When I missed the ball, I wasn't in further danger. I was just in pain. However, if I wasn't expecting the ball, I'd immediately and instinctively go into high alert because of potential danger. Now, the appropriate response to fear when you're in danger is anger. It's primal in self-preservation. The reflex of jumping when suddenly seeing a snake close by is natural and inbred. The adrenaline surges when being threatened by man or beast, particularly when defending oneself and loved ones. We respond differently than when we are threatened than when we are just hurt. Me missing the ball was incidental. Being unaware the ball was coming could have been accidental, yet would trigger anger because of the fear, and more so if you hurt me deliberately. It's important to know the difference, as the level of personal danger matters in our response. Fear and then anger is necessary for my safety in making the appropriate response to the potential threat. It's similar when you lose or misplace something contrasted to something being stolen. What's the difference? Misplacing something is a loss only. Theft is a violation also. And when we are violated, an intruder invades your domain. It threatens an aspect of the world which maintains the balance of your existence. It causes trauma, and with rape, the emotional damage and trauma persists for many years after the physical wounds have long healed. Although the appropriate response to fear is indeed anger, not all fear is appropriate. We have insecurities and inhibitions. We are more ignorant than we are knowledgeable, and we fear change and seek comfort. Our fears need attention to prioritize, to manage our anger, or we could make things a whole lot worse. Not all fear is warranted. Fear being appropriate could save your life, but unwarranted and inappropriate fear could debilitate or even kill you. It takes examination, consideration, and if possible, discussion. This is what we're lacking at the moment. Transparency, courage, insight, information to deal with threats, suffering, and depression in order to be balanced in our response and respond appropriately. In the event of COVID, there has been plenty of fear, and with it, anger and frustration. Have our fears been appropriate? Many haven't demonstrated anger at all. Has that maybe been misguided? Some got angry at the establishment, others got angry with people who challenged the establishment. Can we work out what's been appropriate or not? Turning the other cheek is not the same as turning a blind eye. To turn the other cheek, one first needs to confront reality. As comfortable as that can be, or as uncomfortable as that can be, what's the alternative? What's incidental we should accept, what's accidental should be remedied, and what might be malevolent? There's a big question mark with that one. The event of COVID has been a universal event of suffering. If mistakes were made and more people died and suffered than were necessary, we would do well to identify and rectify things, to spare and save lives. In examining the suffering we've been subjected to, is it clear what's incidental, accidental, or malevolent? We've all suffered. Billions are still suffering today. The consequences of what's occurred, and much of which is still unfolding. To quote our Buddhist friends, though, life is suffering. And we can add on there. And then there is also malevolence. Suffering is inevitable. Some suffering is avoidable. Everyone who's ever lived is either dead or will die soon. No one dies of old age. Some die in old age, yet not of old age. We either die incidentally of an illness, disease, or disorder, or accidentally, or by malevolence. Not all suffering is malevolence, yet suffering is inevitable. Consider also that the only thing which increases death is actually life. Without conception, pregnancy, and birth, death is null and void for humanity. Neither war, famine, pestilence, murder, incidents, accidents, nor disease increases death. Those account for how death occurs, not how much. Without being insensitive to many older people whose lives were lost in the pandemic, is it perhaps more accurate to assess how much life was lost? A child dying loses many years of potential, while a pensioner loses few. Perhaps why the death of a young person is often more tragic. Here's a hypothetical moral dilemma, yet I expect almost impossible to resolve. In the following scenario: you're driving along a street. Two elderly ladies walk into the road in front of you. There's no time to stop and only space to swerve onto the pavement where a young mother has her child in a pram. Or put yourself into incoming traffic. What do you do? Oh, by the way, the two ladies who stepped into the road are your mom and her sister. This is apparently an AI moral and ethics consideration for self-driving vehicles. In the event of COVID-19, thankfully, the young were not afflicted by the virus as much. Unfortunately and tragically, the elderly and already dying suffered the worst of it. The coordinated response with imposed measures and protocols, however, did not discriminate. None of us escaped those. It's easy to blame others in authority when things go wrong, yet we aren't the ones faced with tough decisions. Let's just keep that in mind. And it is said that when we are confronted with two evils, it's always better to try and choose the lesser of the two. Yet often in choosing, the lesser evil is the more difficult choice to make. We are ignorant of the knowledge of good and evil, let's say. Life for humanity is the journey of the discovery of the knowledge of good and evil, as we are conscious and aware of our morality, which means we're still working on a lot of things. The difficulty with freedom, for example, is that we don't know how to manage our own sin. Yet what's the alternative? Don't freak out. Ooh, a religious word, sin. Let me just unmystify it for you. The notion of sin is merely anything which falls short of achieving the ideal. Missing the mark, so to speak, is the direct translation. The trouble with freedom is that we seldom live up to or achieve the ideal. Mostly we miss the mark and fall short of it. From the National Library of Medicine in Canada, there is an article introduced in May 1950. The oral contraceptive pill is a medical innovation that has dramatically transformed generations. Women have gained incredible freedom and reproductive autonomy. The link is in the chapter. Until that moment, and for the previous however many thousand years, the only time a woman couldn't fall pregnant when having sex was when she was already pregnant. Paul Kruger, one of the earliest settlers in South Africa, had 17 children with his second wife. She was pregnant for nearly 13 years of her adult life and nursing many of the years between and after. Or imagine Mrs. Sanna Kruger, that was her name, could manage or plan her pregnancies. For the most part, women today can, and because they can, many achieve academically, have careers, reach heights which seldom, if ever, women managed to achieve before because they were limited and restricted. Yet straight after the birth control pill came the sexual revolution, sexual freedom, and within a couple of years, HIV, a proliferation of sexually transmitted diseases, broken homes, single-parent families in abundance, absent father, and abortions as a norm. With that, and as a result, higher suicide rates, crime, mental illness, and poverty. One of the most powerful technologies ever created with enormous potential to empower women, yet we are discovering the knowledge of good and evil. One of the most powerful technologies ever created with enormous potential to empower women, yet we are still discovering the knowledge of good and evil, so to speak, of its application. And by no means have we achieved the result of the ideal. Today in my country, approximately 2/3 of the babies born every single day don't even have a father written on the birth certificate. With condoms, the birth control pill, and abortion readily available, for those children, I would say, as a society, we've missed the mark. There is an appropriate place for birth control. Like fire in a fireplace, it can keep you warm and heat food, but fire in the lounge on the floor will burn the house down. Another barrier to choosing wisely when we're confronted with two evils, as our leaders have been, is individual motivation. The difference between steadfast and stubborn is humility or pride. Steadfast is virtuous. Stubborn is a vice tending towards viciousness at times. The action is identical, however the motivations are antithetical. In the event of COVID, the authorities were confronted with two evils: a dangerous virus and punitive damaging measures to minimize and mitigate the damage of the virus. It's too easy in hindsight to scream, "I told you so." The luxury of what we know now is not an advantage that the authorities had 3 years ago. It was chaotic and unknown. Things were moving incredibly fast and changing even faster. Tempered consideration is to note that when you are traveling at high speed in one direction in a car, and there is another car coming in the other direction at the same speed, the only thing that protects you is a painted white line, a rule. It's not an impenetrable barrier, it's a painted white line. A white line should never be crossed at high speed or on a blind rise, although sometimes lines must be crossed. I'm prefacing here, not preaching. Lines needed to be crossed. Lines which protected us have been crossed, and slowing down to assess the damage is the best that we can do to prepare ourselves for the future. History is not valuable in looking back at the past, but in preparing for our future. History is only a lesson if we learn from it to do better in the future. What can we learn from the last 3 years? What can we learn from the last 3 years? As a summary of the introduction, these are the main points. There are 3 agents of suffering. All suffering is either incidental, accidental, or malevolent. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Sometimes in intending to do what's best, we do what's worse and cause more damage than if we did nothing at all. Causation matters. Although injuries might be the same, what caused injury needs to be taken into account in order to make sure it doesn't happen again. Causation matters. Incidental suffering is something that we have to endure. But much suffering is avoidable if we pay attention. When there is suffering, or when there is fear generated, the appropriate response to fear is anger. Yet not all anger is appropriate. Turning a blind eye to everything that's happened is not the same as turning the other cheek. Life is suffering, and then there is malevolence. Everybody dies. Every person who's ever been born is either dead or going to die soon. The only thing that increases death is life itself. Without conception, birth, you can't have death. It's a consideration that maybe it's not about how many people died, but how much life was lost in the midst of it all, considering both the pandemic, the virus, as well as the measures. The only thing that protects us when we're traveling on the road at very, very high speed in one direction and somebody else coming in the other is a painted white line, rules and structures to keep us safe. Sometimes we have to cross those lines, but we should never do it at high speed or over a blind rise. History is only valuable in looking forward by considering the past to learn the lessons of what went wrong previously.